Welcome back, students, to Chapter 9, Tourism, Transport and Communication, Part 1. In this session, we will cover pages 61 to 64 of our textbook. We will study how tourism, transport and communication affect the economic growth of both Brazil and India, and we will also compare them accordingly. We often go on school trips. We join friends and relatives to go on nature visits and picnics during vacations. Similarly, in order to reduce stress of our day-to-day life, we get away from our usual surroundings and go to far away places. Now, this is known as tourism. Through tourism, we get to know new places and environments. We feel relaxed and we also acquire knowledge. Now, why tourism is necessary? Tourism boosts the revenue of the economy. It creates thousands of jobs, develops the infrastructure of a country, and plants a sense of cultural exchange between foreigners and citizens. It also helps better understanding and national integration. Now that we know what is tourism, let's move on to page number 16. In figure 9.1, they have given us a line graph. This graph shows the number of international tourists visiting India and Brazil. Number of international tourists visiting India and Brazil. They have mentioned years on the x-axis, where the scale that they have used is 2 centimeter is equal to 5 years, or we could say 1 centimeter is equal to 2.5 years. On the y-axis, they have given the number of international tourists in lakhs. Now the scale here is 1 centimeter is equal to 20 lakh tourists. Now the blue line indicates the number of tourists, international tourists visiting Brazil, and the pink line indicates the number of international tourists visiting India. Now let's study the graph and compare India and Brazil with respect to the number of international tourists over the years. So if we see here, in 1995, the blue line is starting below the pink line. So we can say that the number of international tourists in India were little more than that of Brazil. Okay, because the blue line is below the pink line. In 2000, Brazil has more number of international tourists compared to India. Okay, so now from the year 2000, if you see, India is showing steady increase in the number of international tourists. Okay, whereas Brazil is showing a steady decrease in international tourists. Okay. Now in 2005 also we see the number of international tourists in Brazil are more than that of India, but the difference that we see that the number of tourists in India are increasing slowly and steadily. From the year 2010, okay, we see the number of tourists in India, the number of international tourists visiting India are more than that of Brazil, and here the graph is showing rapid growth in the number of international tourists than Brazil. So based on this, let's move on to the questions that they have given us. So we'll just answer the questions given on this page. Which country attracted more international tourists in the year 1995? So we just saw in the year 1995, India attracted more international tourists? Second question, in which country did more international tourists arrive in the year 2000? So yes, it's obvious here, it is Brazil. The third question, in which year can an increase be seen in the number of international tourists in India? Now here we have to answer a bit properly. Okay, so as I mentioned, from the year 2000, okay, there is an increase in the number of international tourists in India. If you see, the graph is moving steadily. However, after 2010, the growth of international tourists was very fast than that of Brazil. What was the number of international tourists in the year 2015 in both the countries? What was the difference between them? Now here we cannot give you the exact figures, okay, but approximately the number of international tourists visiting Brazil were 60 lakhs, okay, it was 60 lakhs, whereas the number of international tourists visiting India was approximately 130 lakhs. So the difference between these two countries, then the number of international tourists between India and Brazil was almost 70 lakhs. We could say 70 lakhs plus. Now, what could be the reason of increase in tourists in India after the year 2000? Now, there are n number of reasons. Some of them, in the year 2002, the government of India announced a national tourism policy. Now, according to this policy, okay, this policy was built around the 7S mantra. That is Swagat, which means we need to welcome our guests or the tourists properly. So, Suchna, that is information, proper information needs to be given to the tourists. Suvidha, proper facilities were given to the international tourists. Suraksha, that is security, was provided. Sahyog, that is cooperation, was provided. Sanrachna, infrastructure was developed. Safai, cleanliness. So all these factors were taken into consideration to increase the number of international tourists. Then a campaign titled, if you remember, if you ask your parents, a campaign titled as Incredible India was also launched. Okay, in the year 2009, again another campaign was titled as Atithi Devo Bhava. Okay, culture, historical, medical and other business tourism have gained momentum in India because India is a diverse country with tradition, culture and religion. Now we'll study tourism of Brazil. Tourism is an important economic activity here. Clean white sand beaches, attractive sea coasts, beautiful islands, orchards, deep and dense forests of Amazon, and various birds and animals attract foreign tourists here. Tourism contributes more to the national income. Now, ecotourism is developing at a faster rate in Brazil due to its natural resource. Now, what is ecotourism? It means responsible travel to natural areas, travel to destinations where flora, fauna, and cultural heritage are primary attractions, conserving the environment and improving the well-being of the local people there. In figure 9.2 on page number 61, with the help of graph, they have shown us how tourism has contributed to the economy of both Brazil and India in the year 2016. We've already seen this in the line graph that we have studied previously, that in the year 2015, the number of international tourists visiting India were more than that of Brazil. The blue bar represents the percentage of population engaged in tourism. The orange bar indicates the contribution or represents the contribution of tourism in GDP. So let's answer the questions based on this graph. Now, what type of graph is shown here? The graph shown here is a joint bar graph. The bars representing the given information are joined together and it makes it easier to compare the information. The second question, what does the graph show? Now, if the graph shows the percentage of population engaged in tourism and the contribution of tourism in GDP in Brazil and India. Now, GDP here means gross domestic product. It is the market value of the final goods and services produced during a year within the domestic territory of a country. So let's move on to the next question. Which country's tourism has a larger share in the contribution towards GDP? Now we have to see the contribution of tourism towards GDP is shown in orange bar, is shown with the help of orange bar. So if you see here, the share of tourism sector in GDP is more of Brazil. So this is it. The next question, which country has a larger population engaged in tourism? Okay, if you see this blue bar, okay, the bar of India is more. So India has a larger population engaged in tourism sector, but contributes lesser in GDP. If you see the contribution of tourism in GDP, India has a lesser contribution in GDP than Brazil. Now, what could be the reason behind this? The population engaged in tourism in India is more than that of Brazil. Yes, and even its GDP is more. But since the population of India is more than that of Brazil, the contribution of tourism to GDP appears lesser than that of Brazil, and its population engaged seems higher. Tourism in India. We have already studied that the number of international tourists in India is constantly growing. It's constantly growing. And the increase in the number of international tourists is consistent. Okay? That is, it's uniform. Foreign tourists visit India for its heritage, adventure, cultural, health, and business tourism. Ecotourism is also being given a boost in India. Considering the heritage of India, there are plenty of opportunities for tourism in many parts of the country. Many places are being developed for this. Now, this is an article from the Times of India which shows the future of tourism in India. Now let's study the transport system of Brazil with the help of a map and answer the questions based on this particular map. Okay, now this is the index. This is the index where they have mentioned what each symbol means in the map. Okay, and they have mentioned major transport routes in this particular map. So the first question is, which means of transport are seen on the map? Now, the means of transport are roadways, shown in thick pink and thin pink lines. Then we have the railways. Then we have the airways and the waterways. The next question, which means of transport has a denser network? Okay, now as told before, the roadways have a denser network in Brazil. It is spread in more parts of Brazil than any other transport system. So the answer is roadways. The next question, which highway can be seen prominently? Which places does it join? Now the highway that is shown prominently here is the Trans-Amazonian Highway. Now it joins Cruzeiro do Sul, Porto Velho, Manaus and Brasilia. The next question, what could be the reason of development of railways in the southeast? Now if you see here in the map, here the railways are towards the eastern coast and the concentration is more in the southeastern part of Brazil. Now they are asked the reason as to why they have developed in this particular area. Now the development of railways depends mainly on the physical features of an area. They are usually constructed where the commuters is very large. They are usually constructed where the commuters is very large, or we could say where the population is more. The southeastern part of Brazil has fertile and good terrain. Hence, it is easy and cost effective to construct railway routes here. The most densely populated cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro lie in this particular area, which makes it suitable for trade and business purposes. The next question, in which part of Brazil do you see a lesser development of transport network? What could be the reason? So it clearly shows here in the map that the northern part, the central part and the western part of Brazil are transport is less developed in these areas. Okay, now what could be the reason? Simple enough. The reason is the Amazon basin or the dense Amazon forest and the swampy lands. Waterways have been developed for business purposes on the Amazon River. The longest waterways in the world, from Iquitos in Peru, neighboring country of Brazil, to the mouth of the river Amazon. The length of this waterway is approximately 3,700 kilometers, the longest waterways in the world. Paraná River in the south is important for waterways. Coastal shipping is also carried out in the coastal area. Now let's move on to study transport of India. Now on page number 64, they have given us two maps. Okay, the first map shows national highways and major ports. Okay, and the second map shows important railway routes and airports. Now based on these two maps, we have to answer some questions given in the textbook. The first question, which means of transport are visible on the maps? Now, which means of transport? So let's refer to page number to figure 9.10, the first map. Okay, now here they have shown roadways and major ports. So roadways, which would include the national highways, and waterways, which would include the major ports. Now if we refer to figure 9.11, here they've mentioned the railways and the airways. Let's move on to the next question. In which part of India is the density of railways more? Now we'll have to refer to the second map. Now this is the network of railway system in India. Now if we see, the concentration of railway is more here. So the answer to this question is North Indian plains. The next question, name 5 important ports and airports of India. Now the ports of India, for ports of India we have to refer to the first figure. Okay, so the major important ports of India are, so we'll have to refer to this particular sign. So starting from the western part of India, it's Mumbai here, then we have Cochin here, then this sign is in Chennai here, Visakhapatnam and Kolkata. Now major airports are here. Okay, now airports we have Delhi, then we have Mumbai, then I've mentioned Chennai, Vishakhapatnam, and I've also mentioned Ahmedabad, Thiruvananthapuram, Bengaluru, etc. Okay, so very simple. You can just copy this: Mumbai, Cochin, Chennai. You can just, it's easy for you to remember. The next question: which parts of India have a sparse network of transport? What could be the reason? A sparse network of transport. Okay, so if you refer to these two maps, okay, more than the roadways, the network of railways is less in the hilly regions of, okay, in the mountainous regions and the hilly regions. If you see here, the northern part of India, the eastern part of India, okay, the northeastern part of India, then we have the central parts of India and Rajasthan. So these are the places where the railway network is less dense. So what could be the reasons? Now we've already learned all these reasons, the geographical factors like climate, relief features, dense forests, hot and cold deserts, flood-prone areas, frequent earthquakes, landslides, etc. discourage the development of transport in an area. We've studied everything in our previous chapters. Now we just have to relate them. So what happens? It is easier and cheaper to build roadways and railways in plain areas, and that's the reason the concentration of transport, okay, is more in the North Indian plains, because the land is fertile here, plain here, so the cost incurred will be less. Okay, however, it will be tough and costly to construct in hilly areas, deserts, etc. Of course, the cost here, okay, to build roadways or railways would be more than the cost here, because they don't have to construct anything, they don't have to break anything, everything is available here. Okay, now the last reason here, okay, in these places, because of the terrain, relief features and the climate, here there is less population, and hence because of this, okay, transportation is also affected. So these are the few important points that I have jotted down with respect to India's transport. Now India has, we need to know, India has a denser network of transport than Brazil. Okay, about 85% of passenger and 70% of freight traffic are carried by roads every year. Now 85% of passenger means almost 85% of people, okay, they take the roadways, they travel by roadways every year, and 70% of freight, which means 70% of goods, okay, are transported by roadways. The next point: railways are important for the growth of the Indian economy and very useful for covering vast distances. It's also cost effective. Then waterways are a cheap means of transport. They contribute about 1% to the country's transportation. It comprises rivers, canals, backwaters, creeks, etc. Approximately 95% of India's foreign trade moves through the ocean routes. So almost 95% of India's foreign trade moves through the ocean routes because it is very cheap. The waterways are very cheap means of transport. As compared to Brazil, airways in India are more developed and the use of internal airways is also increasing. With this, children, we have come to an end of our today's session. Hope you have understood. Thank you. Stay home and stay safe.